I'm Patricia Anderson. I'm going to be presenting to you today a brief on creating readable print materials, and I'm going to be using the following PowerPoint on typography, creating readable text, to kind of show you some examples as we go through the content that is in the brief. Before we had easy access to computers, printers and graphic designers published all written materials using specific guidelines, and this was called typography, which is the art and the technique of arranging type to make written language legible, readable, and appealing when displayed. Now that we create our own print materials, we need to learn the rules that will make text readable for everyone, including people with reading, language, or visual disabilities and their families. So I want to start by showing you an example. This is actually a trifold brochure that was published by a government agency. And I want you to just kind of glance at it. And as we go through the following examples, I want you to pay attention to how your eyes feel, how your body feels when you see some of these examples, and whether or not you tense up or you relax, because this is the effect that we want to have. We want eyes to be relaxed so that they can get the content that we're trying to present in print materials. So you'll see here we have lines in the background. We have a very busy background here. We have many different colors and many different fonts and a lot of different pieces aligned in different ways. This is page 2. We have up at the top, and here you have things that are all in capital letters, very tight and dark font here. So just kind of pay attention to whether or not you think this would be a document that you would want to pay attention to and read further, or if you just kind of set it aside because it's a little more busy or difficult to read. So two of the key areas that we have to pay attention to when we're talking about readable text are readability and legibility. Readability is defined as the ease with which larger chunks of print can be read and understood, like articles, paragraphs. Legibility deals with the speed with which each letter can be recognized and is part of the type design. Both of these areas are critical for the effective use of computers when you're developing readable print materials. So this is an example of some fonts that increase readability or diminish readability, and the less complex, the better. So you want to stay away from specialty fonts. You want to stay away from script fonts unless it's a signature. Serif fonts, which means with feet. Sorry, I have these backwards. Serif fonts are with feet. That should be down here. And the sans serif fonts don't have feet, which is up here. And it is assumed that the feet on the serif fonts kind of lead your eye across the page and make it quicker to read. On the serif fonts, sorry, the sans serif fonts, you will find that some of the letters are very difficult to distinguish. Here we have a 1, an I, a capital I, a small L, and a capital L, and you can't tell the difference between many of those. So the legibility is poor sometimes in a sans serif font. So when we're talking about print materials, we can have great legibility. So this paragraph is very easy to read, but if you look at it closely, the grammar and the punctuation and some of the wording is not accurate. But on this paragraph, which is very difficult to read because it's in a script font and it's dark and it's condensed, all of the readability pieces are fine. So you really have to pay attention to both readability and legibility. So the serif fonts, these are the common ones that we see. Times New Roman is the most common one. That's what most articles, newspapers, and magazines are printed in, and many books. Georgia is a serif font that is used on computers in particular. Sans serif fonts is really the font that we use when we are learning to read. Arial is a very common one, as is Calibri. When you are creating readable print materials, whether you use a serif font or a sans serif font, you want to use a family of fonts, typeface font families, as opposed to a variety of fonts. If you use too many fonts, it really is difficult for the eyes to pay attention. Another area we need to keep in mind is letter spacing. So when you have condensed fonts or narrow fonts, it's difficult because the letters are too close together and you can't tell them apart. Same thing with a fat or a bold font, more difficult to read. Monospace type, which is what a typewriter uses, has the same space around all letters and spaces, and that is difficult to read because now computers do what we call proportionally spaced type, and the fonts give you different spacing around a letter depending on how wide or narrow it is. So the computer takes care of the letter spacing for you. Point size, the size of the font is important also. Small type is very difficult to decipher, particularly as people age. Large type also requires excessive eye movements. So you need to pay attention to the relationship between the readability and the point size. Typically, we recommend 10 to 14 point type for print materials, with 12 being the average. Larger type tends to hinder reading efficiency. However, for some populations, like those with visual impairments, they do need to have a larger point size of like 16 to 18 point. Typical size for first graders is 18 point. So this is an example in the actual point size. And obviously when you're doing a presentation like this or on a PowerPoint, you want to have a larger point font. I would say no smaller than 24, and even 48 is a rather large unless you have one or two words on a page. The other area we want to be aware of is typecase. Typeset in upper and lowercase letters is much more easy to read. We read in phrases, not letter by letter, so we look at the shape of the word to determine what it is. When we set text in all caps, every word looks like a rectangle, and you have to read slower to pay attention to know what each letter is, so it's more difficult to read. So this is just a quick example in both a serif and a sans serif font. And my reaction to this is I have to back up, I have to move away, and I'm not sure what it says. And it also makes me feel like somebody is yelling at me. So you want to try and stay away from all capital letters unless you're emphasizing one or two words in a phrase, for example. Lowercase letters provide an easier way to read it, and it's much calmer on the eyes. So if you look at the difference between the last slide and this one, your eyes should have relaxed when you get to this slide. This is an example of a handout that was used in a class. This was the original example, and you can see it's very hard to read. And if I were a student in this class, I really wouldn't want to read this particular assignment. I retyped it so it was in upper and lowercase letters with some bullets and some underlining, some white space in between, and it looks much easier to read, much more inviting, so that the student in this case could get the content. We also have to pay attention to type style. So one of the styles is italics, and with both italics, bold, and underlining, you don't want to use a lot of it. You want to use it for emphasis, particularly with underlining. Sometimes it can cut off the bottom of letters. In this case, we have both caps and underlining, which is a little overdone. And it certainly is difficult when you have more text if you're underlining, difficult to make out what you're reading, particularly if some of the lower letters get mixed up with that underline. So type that is too heavy can frustrate the readers. Condensed type makes the eyes go up and down in a vertical pattern as opposed to across the page. And when you're talking about monotype, like extended type, it makes it difficult for the reader to kind of catch up to the words because there's so much space in between the letters and the words. Obviously, we want to stay away from novelty examples. Comic Sans is one that most people like to use, but it really isn't good for typical print material where you're trying to get the content across to your reader. Line length is also an issue when you're creating print materials. Long lines of text may fatigue a reader, so you don't want to have very small margins. Short lines, like in newspaper columns, demand that a person's eyes change frequently. So your eye is going to be going back and forth very quickly. We're looking at approximately 8 to 10 words per line, or 60 to 80 characters and spaces per line, no matter what kind of a font you're using. The leading or the spacing between lines of text can also impact readability. The first example you see here is double space, which in this example is really way too much space. Your eyes have to really jump to find that next line of text. Single spaced, however, particularly in a presentation, can be too tight and make it difficult, and the eye may jump from one line to the other and miss the one in between. So I typically recommend spacing between 1.0 and 1.5. This happens to be single space. I'm sorry, this was less than single space. The other area that we need to make note of is justification of the text. Right align text where it lines up on the right-hand side of the, the right-hand side of the column. Makes the eye difficult to find the next line when you're going back to the left side. So we really want left aligned text, also called ragged right, where the lines on the right-hand side of the paragraph are not even, but they are on the left-hand side. And this is typically what you'll find in most print materials. Centered justification or justified text or centered text leaves uneven spaces. And I remember once reading a centered text, an entire page of centered text, and I just kept going like this, back and forth in the middle. It was very exhausting. So centered text is fine for headers, maybe 1 or 2 lines if it needs to stand out, or an address, contact information. But for the most, you want to have a justification of right justification. So here's just a quick example of what can happen when you justify text with even margins on each side. The letters in the middle can get very spaced out, not easy to read. And the same thing with centered text. Page margins and spacing are also important. It's very important to have white space in your document so that the eye can rest in between reading the text that you want to present. So you want to pay attention to the space between letters, words, lines, paragraphs, columns, and sections, as well as the margins or the space around the outside of the page, or perhaps around a graphic or a picture that's being inserted into the page. The last area I want to talk about here is background or contrast and color. So typically we prefer either dark, black or blue on a light background, or white or yellow on a dark background. People with visual impairments often prefer the dark background with white or yellow print, or blue on a white background. Another area to be aware of is color. This first example was one where I went to a Christmas Eve service, and they handed out the program that was on red with black print, and we were all reading by candlelight. So it was very difficult to read. So you want to pay attention to both the color of the background or the color of the paper that you're using, as well as the type, the color of the type or the font. Another issue that people like to play around with is the background. And as you can see here, in each of these examples, you have something that could prevent the reader from really grasping what the content is that you're trying to present. Here we have a picture of a beach, kind of a faded background. Here we have a graphic that's in the middle of all of the text. Here we have words. This one says confidential. And this one is just words that are presented on a very busy background, which will make it difficult for most people to read. So when you're using color, I would suggest to use it very sparingly, because not only is it difficult to read in many instances, but you also have people who are colorblind who won't pick up the color contrast. Red is very difficult, as is green is very difficult for people to read, even if they aren't colorblind. So only use it sparingly, particularly when you're talking about headlines or titles, or I occasionally will use it as highlighted text. So this is just an example of a dark print on a lighter background, and then using color on color, which makes it more difficult to read. The final two examples are just things that I have no clue what they say. I just happen to find them. And so you really have to pay attention to all of the issues that we talked about to have what you want to present in print material be readable to your audience. So here we have some references. Most of them can be accessed electronically. And then I provided you some additional resources, many of which are on the Raise Center website, that can give you additional information looking at typography and the accessibility of print materials. And then finally, this is my background that gives you an example of where I'm coming from. My training was in special education, school psychology, and learning disabilities. So I'm looking at typography from access to print materials. So hopefully you will find this and the examples and the brief helpful for creating accessible print materials for your organization.